Benjamin Anthony, CEO and founder of MirYam Institute. Welcome to Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Thanks for having me, Jonny. Great to see you.
Indeed, my first ever interviewee 6 years ago. I thought we'd start with the biggest quandary on the planet for Israel, which was to try and solve the Palestinian conflict there and then. 170 episodes later, we are still a very long way, maybe even further than we were 6 years ago from solving that. But the sheer audaciousness of the attack in the north on SMS and pager-based systems, which involved the destruction of Hezbollah's communications devices, has killed at least 37 that we know of, injured thousands, 3,000 in all. And Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah has declared that the strikes had dealt a significant blow to their operations, but vowed Israel would face a severe reckoning. He says it's an accusation, a declaration of war. It's what the West splainers describe as an escalation. It's not an escalation, is it, Benjamin?
No, it's not an escalation. Firstly, before I address myself to that issue, I want everybody to be aware of just the tremendous dedication that you show towards your work in producing Jonny Gould's Jewish State. I think that it's one of one in terms of the breadth and depth and the insight that it provides to all of the listeners about all matters Jewish and all matters Zionist. I think it's a reflection of your personal courage and conviction, and I thank God for it. And I hope that you continue to go from strength to strength and encourage everybody not only to continue to listen to it, but also to undertake their part in sharing its content and sharing the fact that it is out there with their broadest possible network, because I cannot think of a resource or source that is more vital to understanding the picture and constellation of the Jewish story and the Israel story from the perspective of Britain than Jonny Gould's Jewish State. So continue on your way, Jonny. You're making a tremendous contribution to the Jewish people and the Jewish future. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
And with
Benjamin.
regard to whether or not, oh, it's my pleasure. And you know what? I'm just going to make one more comment about that. I grew up in the country in which you still reside. I know it well. I understand the challenges that are manifold and directly facing and advancing toward pro-Israel voices, pro-Jewish voices. What you're doing isn't easy, but it's necessary, and thus you undertake it. And I just think it's tremendously, tremendously admirable. So do continue on your path, Jonny. It's a path that leads all of us to a better place. Thank you. So with regard to whether or not Hezbollah and Israel's purported detonation of their beepers and their communication system constitutes an escalation, no, I don't believe that it constitutes an escalation. I think that the escalation that has been in play and remains in play was when Hezbollah, of its own volition, without any requirement whatsoever for it to do so, decided to join the fray on October the 8th, one day after the greatest massacre launched against the Jewish people since the horrors of the Holocaust. Hezbollah looked, surveyed the landscape, and decided now is the time to have at the Jewish state. Now is the time to attack the Jewish people. And since that date of October the 8th, Hezbollah has rocketed us, it has shelled us, it has killed our civilians, it has killed our soldiers, it has forced 60 to 80,000 of Israel's northern residents to be rendered evacuees in their own land, and it has continued to impede, to harass, and to attack the one and only Jewish state. Now, Israel to this point has focused the mass of its military capabilities on achieving the first of the two war goals. The first of that being the destruction of Hamas as a functioning terror military. We're well on the way to completing that task inside the Gaza Strip. It's not quite completed, but the momentum is at our backs. And the second of those tasks, which is a more complex task even than the first, is bringing home of the hostages. We still have 101 hostages inside the Gaza Strip, some of them alive, others not alive. And of course, military pressure continues to what we hope the process of inducing Hamas to release yet more hostages and return yet more hostages. But that's a subject in and of itself. I don't really want to dissect that here unless you specifically wish me to do so. Turning now to Lebanon, having undertaken the successful operation inside the Gaza Strip, having dismantled much of Hamas, it has been decided that a third war goal is to bring Israel's residents of the north back to their home in an environment of safety. What that is going to require, in my estimation, is a kinetic, severe military engagement against Hezbollah by the Israeli Defense Forces. I'm someone who believes that that should have happened right away after October the 7th. That is in the past. That's not what was ultimately decided. We shouldn't dwell on that. But there is now a requirement for, in my view, a kinetic, determined, long-lasting, if needed, military operation inside southern Lebanon against Hezbollah, and they asked for it. That is the most important point for people to understand. They asked for it. Israel asked them to stay out of the fray. They decided not to do so, much like the Jordanians decided not to do so back in 1967 after being implored by Israel to sit out the conflict between Israel, Egypt, and Syria. Hezbollah has asked for it, and I actually think what the beeper detonations that have been attributed to Israel by foreign media, what that shows is they might just be about to get it.
And the reticence, perhaps, if we go back to October the 8th, for Israel not to retaliate immediately as Hezbollah started rocketing, might be twofold. First of all, the severe shock of what was happening with Hamas in the south, and of course the continued rocket fire that has been going on for nigh on 2 decades, but also the realization, the understanding that there were 150,000 rockets facing Israel. The debate at the time was, can we face these two war fronts at the same time? It was decided that Gaza was priority. And yet now, this is maybe the latest and most dramatic stage of what might be called the scaling operation, shall we say, ahead of any prospective invasion. The reduction in the power of Hezbollah to exact terrible aerial bombardments of Israel's main cities. We have successfully diminished the rocket infrastructure, but there's so much more work to be done, isn't there? Which means, perhaps, Benjamin, that a ground invasion cannot be avoided.
So both of the considerations that you mentioned are correct. I don't support the decision that was ultimately arrived at by way of those two considerations. I think that because the munitions were so vast and so clearly and squarely aimed at the home front inside the state of Israel, on civilian infrastructure inside the state of Israel, I feel very, very strongly that we were able to do what we're now seeing being done, Jonny, which is to significantly degrade and downgrade their aerial capabilities, and also to significantly degrade and downgrade the potency of their terrorist fighters there inside Hezbollah. That could have been achieved from the air, in my view, during the period of time between October 7th and Israel's ground incursion into the Gaza Strip, which, if listeners recall, lasted for about 3 weeks. Now, the Air Force was heavily bombarding Gaza during that time, but Israel is a country that can walk and chew gum simultaneously, and I feel that we would have been able to move more swiftly through the Gaza Strip had we downgraded Hezbollah's capabilities up there inside southern Lebanon. But as I said before, that is past. There's not really any virtue in me revisiting that at this stage. I think that there was a third consideration, though, Jonny. There was a very famous utterance by President Joe Biden, who, in my opinion, started off this war on the right foot, with the right attitude, with the right level of support, traveling to Israel during a war and standing in solidarity alongside the Prime Minister of the State of Israel. I have to give credit where credit's due. I don't think that that's a gesture that is to be taken for granted, but it's precipitously dropped the standard of support from this American administration to Israel to a degree that I find, quite frankly, reprehensible and disgraceful. The withholding of 2,000-pound bombs, for example, telling Israel that it must not go into Rafah, telling the world that 40,000, 30,000 Palestinians inside Gaza have been killed without qualifying that those numbers are coming from Hamas, without passing out that some of those numbers are civilians, but many of those numbers are, of course, terrorist fighters of Hamas. And the list goes on and on. But here's the third consideration I'm referring to. President Biden stood at the podium and said, for anybody thinking of widening this war, I have one word for you. What was the word, Jonny? The word was don't. You remember? He looked right down lens and he said, anybody thinking of taking advantage of this situation to widen this conflict, I have one word for you, don't. And then he repeated it, don't. Many people believe that that was a warning to the Iranians and that was a warning to Hezbollah. But I feel that while he was certainly communicating with those two aforementioned bodies, he was also expressing it to Israel. If you're thinking about widening this, don't. And I think that that served to slow down Israel's progress in southern Lebanon.
Indeed, the don't has been superseded before even he uttered that two words, should we say, do not. The long-term psychological effect, though, of this main communications tool of Hezbollah has been smashed. Who in the south, be they Hezbollah operators, their neighbors, anyone in Lebanese society, will want to look at their phone and think, I might put this away for now, this pager. Who will trust their handheld device in Lebanon? Again, I was doing school security with an old Motorola. Now, I know this Motorola is older than my children. Nevertheless, I did look at it in a comical moment and want to try and give it away. But in all seriousness, this was the main tool that each of these operators, from what I understand from a military briefing that I was told directly, that each of these rockets was placed in a private home. An SMS or a walkie-talkie or a pager would be sent, a little bleep, and that person would then set off this rocket, which was guided towards a certain part of Israel defined by their bosses. No longer, Benjamin, no longer. This has been a huge military success. And as Yaakov Lapin said on the Benjamin Anthony show this week, he said this sets up a new phase in modern warfare.
Yeah, really, it's so important what you're saying here, that we talk about deterrence. Imagine a situation in which you are so deterred that you dare not look at your communications device in order to know when, where, and how to detonate an attack against the state of Israel. That is the situation and the dynamic in which Hezbollah operatives and terrorists find themselves at this time. The setup inside southern Lebanon bears being spoken about somewhat. You have throughout southern Lebanon, arrayed throughout that area, homes. You have kitchen, you have a living room, and then you have a rocket launching room. And it is, as you described it, I have seen the target maps. You may have seen the target maps that have been provided by the Israeli Defense Establishment. And that system that is at play is not currently at play. Now, I emphasize the word currently because while there were injuries and while some of those injuries were severe, they're not injuries that will necessarily remove from the battlefield permanently those who fell prey to this attack, this beeper attack. And therefore, I place the beeper attack, and again, I want to emphasize that has been attributed to Israel by foreign sources only. Israel has not said that we were responsible for this attack. I place that attack into the category of being brilliant, ingenious, but tactical, not strategic. I think that it would have been strategic had it served to be an interruption to the command and communication structure of Hezbollah, which it has done, but was then followed up by a steady, determined, and as I said, if need be, long-standing bombardment of Hezbollah's aerial capabilities and the ground forces of the terrorist army of Hezbollah. That has not happened yet. And therefore, I think that we should view it, as I was discussing on the Benjamin Anthony show with Yaakov, as you alluded to, I think we should view it as really a dual-headed ultimatum. An ultimatum, and Yaakov put this very eloquently, it was an ultimatum to Hezbollah that you're really at the end of the line here, which is saying to them, if you think that Israel is going to continue with this tit-for-tat war of attrition that you have foisted upon us. You are now out of road with that. We are taking this to another level. And the other was to the Americans to express to them that if they think that Israel is able to continue the untenable situation where its residents are out of their homes, where the north is being rocketed, where land has effectively been ceded to this point, I'm hopeful that we will take it back, then the Americans need to understand that we in Israel are going to ratchet up the way in which we are going to fight against Hezbollah. So that dual ultimatum is there. It can be significant if it's heeded, but I actually don't think that anything short of a conflict against Hezbollah, against its fighters, is the order of the day. We have to fight them and we have to remove them from the battlefield. And I'm afraid that that does mean a kinetic engagement in the fashion of a war against Hezbollah.
And the tragedy of that is that the rockets will be set off to Haifa, to Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, etc., which may result in thousands of Israeli civilians killed. Indeed, the beautiful landscape of Tel Aviv's towers being affected or changed. We can't bear to think about that, but that was what was in the minds of absolutely everyone and has been since October the 8th. It's important to say, isn't it, as well, Benjamin, that amid all the coverage, Lebanon is not in a state of war with Israel. Lebanon, it's the insurgent IRGC battalion of Hezbollah, direct battalion of that Revolutionary Guard that has attacked Israel since the day after October the 7th. And yet, the pager and walkie-talkie attack has exposed their infiltration into the Lebanese ruling class. When you hear the Lebanese ambassador to the UK talking, he sounds a little bit like someone from Hezbollah. Someone in Syria got exploded at. It's not just confined to the ruling class of Hezbollah. They have infiltrated deeply over many, many years, it seems.
Yes, they have, and I haven't listened to Lebanon's ambassador to the UK. I don't reside in the UK, and unlike
Don't worry
you,
about it.
because of where I'm not particularly interested in what that individual has to say. Just to be frank and candid with you on the Jonny Gould's Jewish State podcast, because I know that that's the order of the day and the level that you seek. Look, Hezbollah is represented in the government of Lebanon. Hezbollah enjoys broad popularity, not wall-to-wall popularity by any stretch of the imagination, but broad popularity, similar, incidentally, to the level of popularity that we saw Hamas still enjoys after the massacre of October the 7th among the everyday Gazan, who everybody just wants to excuse from their responsibility in many cases in voting in Hamas with the genocidal aspects of its charter against Jews in the state of Israel. So Hezbollah is a party that is political. It's a party that is military. It is a terror organization. And that is why, because of that constellation that it has, that is why Israel has expressed many times, in order to avoid war rather than to bring war about, that if Hezbollah's terror is not curbed, Lebanon will pay a price for it, for hosting it, for having it there, for not rooting it out of its sovereign territory. I mean, can you just imagine if the state of Israel had a terrorist organization within its borders that it refused to deal with, refused to tackle, and that terrorist organization launched on a given day 100 rockets into, Paco or over the Green Line into a Palestinian Arab town such as Jenin, and Israel just turned around and said, well, there's nothing we can do about it. Would the international community accept that? They would not accept it. Israel would be held to account. Israel would be tasked with dealing with that. Israel would be tasked with preventing it from ever happening again. And Israel is now saying to Lebanon, such a standard is the standard to which you will now be held. Don't tell us you can't deal with it. Don't tell us you won't deal with it. If you're not going to deal with it, we will. And that is going to bring about a price against you inside Lebanon. Now, I do want to pick up on one other thing. You're right to speak about the dangers of the massive aerial bombardment that a conflagration with Hezbollah would certainly bring about. It's estimated that they would have the ability to fire 2,200 rockets per day for at least 100 days. So that is a tremendous number of munitions, very, very severe. But I don't think Israel should be living in fear for what happens if we fight Hezbollah. I think that what we should have learned from October 7th is that we should live in fear for what happens if we don't fight these enemies. We have no choice but to fight them. And if we do it in a determined fashion, as we've shown inside the Gaza Strip, as we've shown time and time again, Israel, we will win.
Amen. And though Israel is advancing well in military terms, the jihadists, as you mentioned, who are bent on destruction of the Jewish state, can point to one significant success so far. They are forcing Jews from their homes in the extreme north and south of the country, effectively succeeding in ordering where Jews can live in their own sovereign state. That's why it is so important that a buffer zone can be created beyond Israel's borders, so that citizens can return home to their homes and live without the threat of attack from Gaza and Lebanon. And it's more than just a strategic return for the demands of Israel's borders to be defended, but it's also a historical one. It was the idea that David Ben-Gurion said right back at the beginning of the State of Israel's formation, that we've got to have schools and clinics and food security. You know, we must have tomatoes in the south and eggs in the north. It is absolutely vital because Israel doesn't have any trading neighbors to speak of.
Yeah, so important. What a great man that diminutive-looking fellow David Ben-Gurion was. How precocious, how certain was he? By the way, how informed was he? Primarily because he was a secular religious man, if I can put it that way. He was a man who did not operate in accordance with prescribed Jewish ritual, but his positions on Israel were deeply informed by his extensive professorial understanding of the Bible and his view of Israel's place among the nations as presented in the Bible. And so you want to see that sort of leadership today. And if you can't necessarily see that sort of leadership everywhere at all times, I think that you want to see those principles being pursued and enacted on the ground. And what you're also referring to there, Jonny, is the conviction in Israel since the days of David Ben-Gurion, and by the way, reiterated in the modern moment by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that Israel must have the ability to farm all the way up to what is called the last row of cultivation, right up to the border. But importantly, Jonny, not 1 inch beyond that border. And that goes back to, incidentally, the Bible again. It goes back to the idea that when the Almighty was guiding the Jewish people toward the promised land, and he spoke out and sketched out verbally the borders of where the promised land will be, he assigned a certain territory for that purpose, but it was also clearly expressed, but not outside of those borders, not beyond those borders. This part of the landscape you will not go into. This part of the landscape you will not settle. And so that's the modern attitude in Israel. And yes, in order to achieve that in the south and in the north, we have to push Hezbollah back. But here again, I'm going to say something that is a minority viewpoint, a minority perspective. I actually don't like this idea of pushing Hezbollah back, because within that formula is that they continue to exist, right? If you're merely pushing someone back to a less advantageous position for them, they're going to reconstitute themselves just in a different location. I don't think that we have to just push them back. I think that we have to eliminate their fighting capabilities completely, eliminate their fighting capabilities. We have to take their terror fighters off the battlefield once and for all. And we in Israel are able to do that. And only through that can we bring security to our residents of the north, because, Jonny, given the ordinance that Hezbollah has, the current area of withdrawal, of pushing them back up to, which is beyond the Litani River, quite frankly, that's rather an arbitrary line. They can reach as rockets as shellas from there as well. So you have to remove them from the battlefield. You have to fight them. You have to kill them, and you have to eliminate them. And I know that that's not popular parlance from the land of tea and scones, the reality of the Middle East.
Indeed, the flag wavers continue outside my door here in London. And you take this position, may I proffer, it's because you are a veteran of the 2006 Lebanon War. You know the place, the terrain, even the people. Hezbollah are not indigenous to Lebanon. It's different in character to Hamas and Gaza in that respect, although, as you mentioned before, not quite as much as it's perceived. Also, of course, Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, Operation Protective Edge in 2014. But let me ask this, would a significant portion of Lebanon's citizens, unlike those of in Gaza, in fact be supportive of Israel's attack on Hezbollah? They are seeing their economy, once Beirut, the exciting, I don't know, Cannon Nice of the Middle East, the playground as such, huge inflation and poverty in the last 30 years or so, that huge warehouse of explosives that went off, obviously part of an external terrorist organization. Would the Christians of Lebanon, would some of the peaceful Arabs and Muslims of Lebanon actually cheer on Israel's attempt at destroying Hezbollah?
Yeah, so I think that the population inside Lebanon is far less monolithic than the population inside the Gaza Strip. You're correct. I think it's also far less monolithic than the population inside Judea and Samaria of the Palestinian Arabs, rather. Although there are different viewpoints and different degrees of Unitarian thinking. Inside Gaza, that is much higher than inside Judea and Samaria. But I do want to make it clear, both inside the Gaza Strip and inside Judea and Samaria, far too many Palestinian Arabs are wholly supportive of what Hamas did on October the 7th and would be supportive of Hamas doing the same again. In Lebanon, it is a different constellation. It's a different grouping of demographics. You certainly have the Christian community that historically has been rather supportive towards Israel, certainly by comparison. You do have different sects of the Muslim faith. Of course, Hezbollah is Shiite. They are sent there on the service, at the service of the mullahs in Iran. And I think that the cheering on that you spoke about in terms of the Lebanese population, that will be directly tied to how much Israel's response inside Lebanon impacts upon the day-to-day lives of your average Lebanese people. If this is very, very targeted and it deals only with Hezbollah's infrastructure, deals with only Hezbollah's terror fighters, I think that the objection to Hezbollah's presence will remain, as it has done to this point, rather muted. We haven't seen the broader Lebanese population vomit out Hezbollah from in its midst. If the war has to take on a wider character, a broader character, if there is a requirement and a readiness by Israel to detonate critical areas of infrastructure inside Lebanon, then you may see the Lebanese people turn around and say, we don't want you here, we don't need you here, we are paying a Pyrrhic price for having you here. And I'll give you one indicator for that. You're already, after this detonation of the pages, you are already seeing the complete overwhelming of the medical system inside Lebanon. They are not able to deal with the sheer influx of the injured who have come by way of this pager attack. A domestic population, as you know from the land of the NHS, if it sees its healthcare system overwhelmed, it does tend to revolt. It does tend to revolt. If the British see the National Health Service with too long a waiting time in order to see a general practitioner or a specialist, a surgeon or a doctor, people start to get very, very uneasy very, very quickly. And Hezbollah has been shown to be placing Lebanon in a dynamic where it cannot tend to its elderly, sick, infirm citizens who have nothing to do with the conflict. Those same citizens, I believe, could be compelled to object to whatever force brought about that reality, namely Hezbollah.
And it's an incredible time for Israel's intelligence and boots on the ground, because at the same time, the nation has conducted a series of operations in Syria, Damascus even, Masyaf and Homs, Significant strikes, military personnel, members of Hezbollah, research centers involved in the production of chemical weapons, military bases, locations associated with Hezbollah and other Iran-backed militias. Israeli tactics seem to consistently be showing Tehran, the head of the snake, that it's willing to defend itself even thousands of miles into foreign territory. And I'll mention the word Yemen as well while we're at it.
Yes, it's interesting because this pager attack incidentally changed. We spoke about this phrase earlier on in our conversation, changed the rules of the game. We've had a situation where Hezbollah and Israel have been trading blows without any really concussive blows being dealt, but the pagers have changed the geography of where Israel has shown it's ready to operate. You referenced Syria. I want people to know that many of the pages that were detonated inside Syria. We have obviously disrupted their communications. We have shown the vulnerability of Hezbollah. We have demonstrated where we are willing to attack. And as you said at the top of this program, we've also shattered the confidence of Hezbollah terror operatives as a consequence of this. I don't think that we've dealt a heavy enough blow to the Houthis in Yemen. I think that the notion that they could fly a missile just recently into the state of Israel really beggars belief. I think that that is a terror organization that can be dealt with swiftly and decisively. It's probably not actually being dealt with as swiftly and decisively as I would like to see, because the dealing of those blows has been outsourced to the Americans and also to an international force that is trying to prevent the Houthis from disrupting the waterways over there in the area of the Red Sea. But I think that we can deal with them. We're right to be attacking Hezbollah's capabilities in Syria, obviously right to be doing so in Lebanon. And yes, Jonny, I would like to see a far more determined, clear, brazen series of disruptions inside Iran, attacking the head of the snake, dismantling their military capabilities. And I think that we can do it not because, as people listening to this might think, I'm some sort of jingoist or bombast. I'm not at all. I know well the cost of war. I also know well the cost that is being extracted from Israel as a result of us not waging war with the intensity that we're able to do so, and having not done that for several years. But I think that we need to do that because we need not fear the Iranians. We need not fear the Iranians because, as has been shown from their unsuccessful strike from their sovereign territory towards Israel's sovereign territory, in terms of kinetic, direct capabilities, the Iranians are a paper tiger. We can deal with them. Their proxies, however, are a completely different level of threat. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. We have a very clear calculus that we must resolve. Do we want to deal with Iran's proxies while their patron does not possess nuclear capabilities, or do we want to deal with them when their patron, Iran, has a nuclear weapons capability? I think that the answer is clear. Let's deal with the proxies now, and then we must turn to the head of the snake and dismantle its cognitive and military capabilities.
Benjamin Anthony, CEO of MirYam Institute, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Thanks very much, Jonny. Pleasure to be with you.